Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about phthalates and ADHD. What's the connection, and what are phthalates? So, start off with Happy New Year, and I'm on a newer setup that I haven't used for a while, so if sound is not coming through, please let me know. And I'll start with the take-home message. So the take-home message is that phthalates are the most common compounds that are added to plastics. Plastics themselves are ubiquitous in our environment. It's not just the big plastic patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and other oceans, but microplastics are found throughout the world in trace amounts in our bodies. And some of the most studied chemicals within the plastics are called phthalates. They are known to be associated with reproductive endocrine disruption. And more than a score of studies over the last at least 15 years now have shown that higher levels of exposure to phthalates during pregnancy are associated with higher rates of children developing ADHD. And it's not just those studies which would be correlational, but we also have animal studies where animals exposed during pregnancy to phthalates have offspring that show an increased amount of ADHD-like symptoms, whether it's hyperactivity or inattentiveness or impulsivity. So that's why we're talking about it today. So I will launch into what are phthalates. I gave you a little bit about it. So phthalate isn't just one specific chemical. It's a whole family of different compounds, more than a few dozen different compounds, some of which are converted and broken into each other, some of which are designed and used separately. So they are chemicals that are added into plastics during the manufacturing. And if many of you are older, or as old as I am or older, you might remember most plastics 50 years ago were fairly rigid, brittle. Things made of them were rigid and brittle. And it's the additives, things like the phthalates, that add flexibility, so you can bend and move them, pliability, durability, so they last longer, and some of the translucency. So things like vinyl flooring, adhesives, lubricating oils, plastic clothes like raincoats, polyvinyl, everything that's polyvinyl chloride, PVC pipes used for plumbing, the insulation on wires, so all the flexibility of the insulation on any of your computer connections is almost certainly phthalates were used in the making of that. And another big one is medical tubing. So everything hooked up to the IV, most of the bags and other devices there use amounts of phthalates. And separate from within plastics, there is a separate category or usage of phthalates. And so they're added to soaps, shampoos, hairsprays, and nail polishes, things we're applying directly to our bodies. And again, to convey some usually flexibility, translucency, durability to some of those products. So they are ubiquitous in our world. There are two big groupings, so they're lumped into small molecular weight and large molecular weight, depending on how big the molecule is, with something called DEHP, so di-2-ethyl-hexyl phthalate being the most common and most ubiquitous. But again, there are dozens of these, and that complicates the issue of studying them, because if you're only surveying or assaying for one type of phthalate, and it may be a different phthalate that has potentially negative consequences on development or brain growth, then if you're looking for the wrong one, you may not find any connection or association. So a few other things are phthalates are fat soluble and relatively short-lived. So these are not the eternal chemicals or forever plastic chemicals that are added and will persist in our environment for decades and decades. These are broken down fairly rapidly, but we're getting continuous ongoing exposure. So that's part of why they're problematic. And the fact that they're fat soluble is important because the brain is such a fatty tissue, and something that dissolves or goes into the brain is more likely to have potential effects at it. So I'll be talking a little bit also about something that's not a phthalate. So there's a different plasticizer agent that's added in the manufacturing plastics called BPA or bisphenol A. And Most of the commonest source there is it's in the lining of many food containers and enters our bodies through our food supply. Again, with the phthalates, most of it is through direct skin contact, some amount through ingestion, drinking and eating, and some small amounts, again, it's in the air itself. So these chemicals are present during the manufacturing of plastics. So some of that's when it's entering the air and atmosphere, but more importantly with the phthalates, it's probably during day-to-day usage. So again, if you have vinyl flooring on your tiling on your floor, you're daily into contact with it, that's sort of off-gassing or breaking down slowly over time, releasing some of these chemicals. When plastics are recycled, if they contain phthalates, then that releases phthalates and exposes people to phthalates. And unfortunately, even though recycling is a good practice in general, when you recycle phthalate or plastics, PVC particularly that contains phthalates, you are likely to be exposed to more and have more phthalates enter human bodies than when you're using virgin new PVC, which particularly in the European Union, there are restrictions and reductions in how much of the older and more harmful phthalates can be added to those items. So, and then disposal, when plastics containing phthalates are taken to the dump or thrown on the ground or left in the environment as they break down. As plastic breaks down, it does release the phthalates. So the phthalates are, again, introduced in the process to make the plastic have these different properties or capabilities. They are not chemically linked, bound in a chemical bond to the plastic. So they are free to leach out. So several people have asked, isn't ADHD a genetic condition? If it's based on our genes, how are environmental things even affecting the likelihood or possibility of developing ADHD? So the simple answer is that there's nothing that's purely a genetic condition. It's always an interaction between genetics and the environment. So I'll start with reference to Huntington's chorea. So in many textbooks, it's the textbook. It's an autosomal dominant gene. If you have one copy of the gene from either parent, then you will develop Huntington's disease, which involves large-scale body movements and usually a variety of psychiatric issues, including depression, including psychosis if it goes on long enough. There's other writhing movements to it that is an invariably fatal disease if it goes on long enough, but usually doesn't start showing up often until middle age. There are variants where you have more copies of the DNA that are interfering with the gene, so multiple copy variants where it does show up earlier. But if you have the copy and you get hit by a truck, not wanting to be grim, at the age of 20, you will never know whether at 45 you're going to inevitably develop Huntington's. So I'm making the point that even a completely genetically determined condition like Huntington's, whether it gets expressed is also due to what happens to you and your interaction with the environment. ADHD is not completely genetically determined. If it were, identical twins they'd either both be concordant, they would both have it or both not have it. And we know there is usually, if your twin has it, your identical twin, you will, but some of the time not. So about 80% of the heritability is genetic, which gives more room for environmental impact to lead to the development of ADHD. And ADHD, we know the genetics aren't a simple autosomal dominant condition. It is a polygenic condition where hundreds, if not thousands, of genes are each contributing a tiny, tiny bit. And the ADHD itself is something that exists on a spectrum of severity. So you may have a certain genetic predisposition, but if you have some environmental onslaught, that may push you to having more severe symptoms or enough symptoms finally to fully qualify for the condition when you might not have if you hadn't been exposed to that environmental condition. So the data, there have been scores of studies looking at the association, and a few recent meta-analyses said that found that more than 90% of these, so meta-analysis looking at all the studies, more than 90% of the studies looking for an association between ADHD and exposure to phthalates during pregnancy did find an association. That's not 100%. There are probably issues of publication bias. So if you're finding an association, it may be easier to get it published. And there were variations. So some studies saw equal effects between the two genders. Some found a more pronounced effect on boys than on girls. Some found actually the opposite situation. So there's not complete unanimity, but a recent study looking at environmental contributors to ADHD, and they were not including everything in the environment. So they weren't looking at cigarette smoking, they weren't looking at Tylenol exposure, which both have been associated with increased rates of ADHD. They were looking more at environmental pollutants, as it were. And of the top three that they felt that there was, the survey of the literature found the most consistent and strongest association with increased development of ADHD. The top three were lead, which we're not going to be talking about today, phthalates, and bisphenol A, PBA. So these are, again, strongly linked. That doesn't mean there aren't other environmental toxins, which including cadmium and mercury, which may be linked with ADHD, but we won't be talking about those today. And in particular, looking at a broader range than just pure symptomatically diagnosed ADHD, phthalates seem to be involved in a range of neurodevelopmental processes, particularly concerning that lead to conduct problems, vocabulary, scores, whereas bisphenol A has been more strongly associated with hyperactivity, emotional control, behavioral inhibition, but both of them linked to ADHD itself. So the other difficulty in this field of research is most of the studies look at, get a urine sample from the mother during some point in pregnancy, just usually one point, and then look at some period of time after, when the children are 3 or when the children are 10 or 20, and assess whether there's ADHD, or sometimes they looked at executive function deficits or other problems. So the difficulty is there. And so one is when they're assaying the urine, they're almost always looking at just a few of the possible phthalates. So again, if you don't assay for the one that's important for causing problems, you're going to miss an association. Assays are expensive, so there have to be limits on what gets studied. 2 is that most of the studies are looking at 1 or most, sometimes 3 different points during pregnancy and getting some composite score of phthalate exposure. Again, phthalates break down pretty darn quickly, so your level from day to day is going to fluctuate and change if your exposure to them has changed. And particularly with brain development, we have what are called critical periods. So the critical period means there's a period during pregnancy when the individual is susceptible to onslaughts or attacks or disruption. And there's other times the same intervening factor may have no effect later on. And it's usually particularly when either nerve cells are being made, or more importantly, nerve cell connections cells are being wired together. So, and then the third point is, when are you testing? So some studies have found exposure to phthalates is showing up as early as age 3 in terms of ADHD-like symptoms, when those ADHD symptoms were rigorously diagnostically tested. There's at least one study done in Mexico where it found that phthalate exposure during childhood wasn't that strongly connected to ADHD symptoms, but it was if you waited until looking at the kids during later adolescence. So other important things are that even though governments, including the US, have safety limits, some of the changes, and again, not just likelihood of ADHD, but some of the endocrine changes, some of the reproductive interference disruptive effects seem to be happening at dosages lower than what are considered safety dosages. And the other issue is that there are clearly combination effects. And maybe the best study I saw on this was an animal study where they administered phthalate, a specific phthalate or bisphenol A during pregnancy to a rat, and then looked at whether there were ADHD-like symptoms in the offspring, which there were. But when they combined 3 different environmental pollutants together, they apparently seemed to cancel each other out because there didn't seem to be any effect then. So there could be a multitude of combination effects we will miss by just looking at one agent at a time. So jumping back to the question, how could these possibly be affecting the brain now, the development of the brain or the likelihood for ADHD? So starting with, again, the best studied or known effect is that phthalates are endocrine disruptors. So they affect how sex hormones are working throughout the body. Certain physical abnormalities in terms of shapes and sizes of genitals have been seen to be affected in humans and correlated with phthalate exposure during pregnancy, particularly in males. But that's and I have a previous video here on testosterone. The sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, aren't just having effect on our genitals. There are receptors throughout the brain for both testosterone and estrogen. And again, messing with that hormonal axis could well affect how your brain develops and how you might respond. And then particularly given that ADHD seems still, to the best of our studies, show some sexual, that the boys are more likely to be affected. Yes, they are clearly more likely to be diagnosed and recognized, but probably are more likely to develop ADHD. Second method whereby phthalates could be affecting or contributing to ADHD is, again, I said these are very lipophilic. They bind to lipids, they dissolve in lipids, they aren't particularly water soluble. The brain is one of our fatty tissues. So anything these are shown to actually disrupt the synthesis of fats, lipids in the body, including in the brain. And if you affect how brain cell membranes work, you're going to affect how cells connect and how they function, nerve cells. 3, phthalates suppress neurogenesis. So that means they are impairing how neurons are made or overall number of neurons made. And not just how the neurons are made, they suppress synaptogenesis. So not just whether nerve cells are made, but how the nerve cells are actually wiring or connecting to each other. Separate from the endocrine axis, there are at least 2 other hormonal axes in the body which are affected by phthalates. So phthalates can affect thyroid hormone. And again, thyroid isn't just determining, your thyroid is a gland here that has a major role in temperature regulation, but there are also thyroid hormone receptors in the brain, and there are brain and behavioral effects of thyroid hormone. There's also growth hormone is affected by phthalates, and there's a number of different growth hormones, but one fairly recent study found that the correlation was actually stronger between development of ADHD, phthalate use, and disruption of growth hormones than it was with thyroid hormones. So maybe it's the growth hormone angle that is causing more than we would expect brains to develop ADHD. 2 other big sources where we could be contributing to the development of ADHD is phthalates cause inflammation in the brain. So inflammation, there's another video in this series on autoimmune conditions. We know overactivation of the immune system of inflammation increases your likelihood of developing a brain that has ADHD. And then the last, maybe not the last one that's being studied at this point in time based on our knowledge is the epigenetic connection. So your genes are one thing, that the blueprint for making proteins in your body is highly important, which version of which genes you get. But I would argue that even more important than what the blueprint is which genes are being turned on, which genes are being turned off, because you might have version X of a gene, but if it's never being activated, who cares? It doesn't matter. And we know that phthalates affect the rate at which methyl groups are stuck on different parts of the DNA to activate or inactivate them. So one other study in the last few years looked at trying to figure out what's, again, the mechanism or part of how these phthalates are affecting the brain, and why people who are prone to be developing ADHD may be more likely to be affected adversely by the phthalates. So what this study found was, if you looked at, and they looked at kids with Asperger's, looked at kids with ADHD, looked at kids with neither condition, and they looked at enzymes which are called the glucuronidation enzymes. So I mentioned the phthalates themselves are fairly fat soluble. They're not particularly water soluble, but how do we get rid of most of our toxins in our body? Is we pee them out. Urine is a water-based solvent, and you usually have to make something more readily dissolvable in water to be able to eliminate it. So the process called glucuronidation is a major pathway for getting rid of phthalates from your body. And again, this is a complicated, multifaceted system. There are dozens and dozens of different glucuronidation enzymes which are designed to stick the glucuronidate moiety, which again converts something from not at all dissolvable in water to much more dissolvable in water. So we have a system that's designed to stick these molecules or moieties onto a range of very different molecules. And it was particularly the glucuronidation pathway that's specific for phthalates that seem to be impaired in those who have ADHD. So whereas other glucuronidation pathways were working normally, so even with comparable rates of exposure from either placentally or maybe early in life to phthalates, someone with the genetic propensity to develop ADHD may be more likely to be lousy at getting rid of phthalates, so they will have higher levels of phthalates in their body, blood, and brain, and therefore more likely to suffer from the negative consequences, whether that's epigenetic changes, inflammation, messing with growth hormone, or others. So the bottom line is we live, whether or not Barbie wins multiple Oscar awards, we live permeated with the plastics throughout our world. If you are concerned about this, you can certainly take steps to have natural wood flooring or surfaces instead of vinyl on the inside or outside of your house, there on your floors. In terms of your clothing, certainly there are options to avoid or eliminate or reduce exposure to PVC vinyl type plastics. Glass is a more inert container of food items than most of our cans. So what's floating in from the air, we have less ability to change, except changing where you live potentially, although again, these are throughout the world. And probably the biggest effort or impact is going to be continuing to lobby governments to make restrictions on what companies can stick in their plastics. And there are substitutes for the phthalates, and there are differences within the group of phthalates. Some may be more toxic than others, some last longer than others. In general, it's the shorter molecules that seem to be more prone to imitating some of our normal hormones and disrupting it. But the good thing is those are some of the shorter acting phthalates as well, so they can break down or get disposed of. So that's about all I have to say regarding phthalates and the ADHD connection. And I have not yet completed the schedule for the rest of the month, but I will be doing that in the next few days. And I will open to any questions right now if anyone has them. So looks like they do. So Mr. AKA 1996 asks, how do you get somebody with ADHD to clean their room? You give them homework. Happy belated New Year's. So So it highlights maybe not exactly one of my favorite quotes. I did not make this up. It was around years before I got into the ADHD field, but that the basic distinction between neurotypicals and people with ADHD is that neurotypical brains are importance driven and ADHD brains are interest driven. So the job is usually to make something more interesting, not to say you really have to do it. This is important. This is important. The person with ADHD knows they have to move their car on street cleaning day. They know they need to clean up their room. They know these things are important. They acknowledge, they recognize it, and they don't do it. You need to make it interesting enough. And interesting enough, maybe if your choice is clean your room or do your homework, then you might finally get your room cleaned. So thanks for that, Mr. AKA 1996. I was at a different time than I am usually. If this is a better time of day than I usually am, about 6 hours later, let me know, because I may be changing the schedule. For at least the next several months, I'm still planning on being live every Tuesday. So thanks for being here, and thanks sharing this with people you might think are interested in it. And stay healthy and happy. And I will be back next Tuesday, presumably at our 6 o'clock West Coast, 4 o'clock Hawaii. I'm going backwards. 9 o'clock East Coast US time. That's all.